Aaron Rodgers is back for his 22nd NFL season, and Pittsburgh is not treating this like a short-term fix. They built around him. They drafted him protection. They brought in weapons. They handed the keys to a 42-year-old quarterback and called it a solution. Now, the only question is whether Rodgers can still hold up long enough to make that bet pay off. The Steelers do not make reckless decisions. That is the reputation. That is what 2 decades of Mike Tomlin football built into the culture of that organization. They are a team that values stability, toughness, and process. So when Pittsburgh decided Aaron Rodgers was their answer, they did not make that call lightly. They made it because they had already seen what life without a real quarterback looked like. The Steelers spent last season searching. They had options, but none of them felt like the kind of player you build a deep playoff run around. The roster had pieces. The defense was still competitive. The coaching was still solid. What they lacked was the one thing that separates a 9-win season from a 13-win season in the modern NFL. A quarterback who can win games by himself when the game plan falls apart. They decided Rodgers was that quarterback. And to their credit, they did not just sign him and hope for the best. They invested. A first-round pick spent on an offensive tackle means the Steelers looked at protecting Rodgers as a priority, not an afterthought. You do not spend that kind of draft capital on a position that does not matter to your plan. Pittsburgh told you exactly what they think about keeping Rodgers upright when they made that selection. Then add the weapons, new targets, more options in the passing game. The Steelers did not hand Rodgers a skeleton crew and tell him to figure it out. They tried to give him everything he needed to succeed, and then there is Mike McCarthy. This is not a random pairing. Rodgers and McCarthy have history, real history. They won a Super Bowl together in Green Bay. They also had years of friction, disagreement, and eventually a split that left both of them with unfinished business. Now they are in the same building again, this time in Pittsburgh, with one shared goal. A reunion like that can go 2 ways. Either the history makes them sharper, more aligned, more focused on getting it right the second time, or the old tension comes back and makes everything harder. The Steelers are betting on the first version. That is a reasonable bet. It is also a risky one. Pittsburgh built a case for why this works. The protection, the weapons, the familiar coach. But building a case is not the same as winning playoff games. And at 42, Aaron Rodgers is operating on a timeline that does not have much room for a slow start. Aaron Rodgers is one of the best quarterbacks in NFL history. That is not a debate. The arm talent, the football intelligence, the ability to extend plays and find answers in moments where most quarterbacks fall apart. At his peak, he was as good as anyone who has ever played the position. The question is not whether Rodgers was great. The question is whether enough of that is still there at 42. The NFL is not kind to quarterbacks who age past the point where their body can keep up with what their mind is telling them. The game is faster at the line of scrimmage than it has ever been. Pass rushers are bigger, longer, and more athletic than any generation before them. The windows a quarterback has to throw into are smaller. The margin for error on every decision is thinner. All of that gets harder when your body has absorbed 22 seasons of professional football. Rodgers knows this. He is not naive about what time does to a player. He has watched it happen to others. He has talked publicly about his approach to longevity, his training, his recovery process. He has done everything a quarterback can do to extend a career at the highest level. But there is a number that does not care about any of that preparation. That number is 42. No quarterback in NFL history has carried a Super Bowl contender at 42. Tom Brady came close to that territory, and Brady is still the measuring stick for late career performance. Even by Brady's standard, what Pittsburgh is asking Rodgers to do is something that has never been done at this age. That is not a reason to assume failure. It is a reason to ask honest questions about what success actually looks like from a 42-year-old starter, because here is the uncomfortable version of this story. The one Pittsburgh fans do not want to hear but need to think about. What if Rodgers is good enough to be decent, but not good enough to be dangerous? A quarterback does not have to collapse completely to cost a team a playoff run. He just has to be slightly less than what the moment requires. That is the specific risk Pittsburgh is carrying into this season, not that Rodgers falls apart. Not that he gets injured in week 1 and the season is over. The real risk is quieter than that. The risk is that Rodgers plays 15 games, wins 9 or 10 of them, and the Steelers finish the season as a wild-card team that nobody fears in January. That is a real outcome, and it would represent a failure of the vision Pittsburgh sold when they committed to Rodgers. The Steelers are not trying to be a wild-card team. They have a defense that can compete with anyone. They have a coaching staff that knows how to prepare for playoff football. They built around Rodgers specifically because they believe he is the piece that turns them from a good team into a dangerous team. If he is not that, if he is solid but limited, if the deep throws are shorter and the decision-making is half a beat slower, then all that investment lands them exactly where they were before. Maybe a little better. Not good enough. That is what the critics are pointing at when they raise the age question. Not malice. Not a desire to see Rodgers fail. Just the honest math of what happens when a team puts its entire offensive identity on a 42-year-old body for a full NFL season. The Steelers need Rodgers to be a top 10 quarterback. They need him sharp in December and locked in for January. They need him to be the guy who makes the defense face a different problem than they planned for. At 38, that was reasonable to expect. At 40, it was still possible. At 42, it requires something that very few players in any sport have ever delivered. Mike McCarthy has seen Rodgers at his best. He knows what that version of the quarterback looks like. The real question is whether the version he gets in Pittsburgh is close enough to that to matter. The Steelers did not sign Aaron Rodgers to be average. They signed him to be a problem. Whether he still has enough left to be that kind of problem is the question this entire season is going to answer. The waiting is over. Aaron Rodgers is a Pittsburgh Steeler heading into his 22nd season at 42 years old with a rebuilt offense around him and a former Super Bowl winning coach calling the plays. Pittsburgh made every move they could make to put him in position to succeed. The tackle, the weapons, the familiar voice in his headset from the Green Bay days. On paper, the setup is real, but the NFL does not decide games on paper. It decides them in December and January when everything gets harder, and the margin between a good quarterback and a great one shows up in the score. The Steelers are betting that Aaron Rodgers still has enough left to be the second kind. That bet might be right. It also might be the most expensive lesson Pittsburgh has learned in years. There is also a legacy dimension that nobody is talking about loudly enough yet. Aaron Rodgers is already one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. That does not change regardless of what happens in Pittsburgh. But what he does this season will become part of how that career gets remembered at the end. A deep playoff run, maybe a Super Bowl push, adds a final chapter that most great players never get the chance to write. It gives the story a clean ending. But a quiet, average season at 42 that finishes in January with nothing to show for it leaves a different image behind. Not on the overall legacy, because that is already secure. On the last picture, fans remember how players exit. Pittsburgh gives Rodgers a real shot at a good one, but it also puts him in a position where the ending is not fully in his control. A body that responds half a step slower than he needs. A big game in January where the arm just is not there. Rodgers is not just a Steeler making a comeback. He is a 42-year-old quarterback gambling that he picked the right moment, the right city, and the right coach for one final run at something real. The Steelers are not the only ones with everything on the line this season. So is he. One season from now, everyone will know the answer.